My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Dad's new wife will be there, she said, refusing to look at the camera. We want her to feel like she is part of the family. I did not argue. I let my ex-husband laugh about my little government salary, and I went back to base for another Christmas on duty. But at midnight on Christmas Eve, my daughter called me. She was crying hysterically over the sound of armed agents tearing through their luxury cabin. "Mom," she screamed into the phone, "why did the Pentagon just call Dad?" Before I tell you exactly how I answered that question, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant ex exactly who they are dealing with. I sat on the floor of my modest off-base apartment in Arlington, carefully folding the edges of thick silver wrapping paper around a new laptop for my 15-year-old daughter Chloe. I had saved for months to buy it, taking on extra shifts and rigidly adhering to a strict budget just to make sure she had the best equipment for her advanced coding classes. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the radiator fighting against the bitter December chill outside. I was pressing a piece of tape against the corner of the box when my phone chimed loudly with an incoming FaceTime request. I answered immediately with a bright, genuine smile, expecting to see Chloe excited to finalize our holiday travel arrangements to visit my parents down in Georgia. Instead, the screen showed my daughter looking down at her lap. Her beautiful dark curls fell forward, hiding her face, and her shoulders were hunched in that specific protective way she always adopted when she was preparing to deliver bad news. She would not look into the camera. I set the wrapped gift down on the carpet, the metallic paper crinkling in the silence. I asked her what was wrong, keeping my voice soft, steady, and entirely maternal. She took a ragged, shaky breath, her eyes darting nervously off-screen to someone I could not see. She finally looked at the camera, her expression caught between guilt and defiance, and delivered the words that instantly froze the air in my living room. "Mom, you should not come to the Aspen cabin for Christmas. Dad's wife will be there. We want her to feel like she is part of the family." The silence that followed her statement was absolutely suffocating. I felt a sharp physical ache rip through my chest, a sudden hollowness that threatened to pull me under. Part of the family. As if the woman who gave birth to her, who had rocked her to sleep through countless fevers, who had bandaged every scraped knee and dried every tear, was suddenly an outsider in her own child's life. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask her if she was being forced or coerced into saying this, but before I could process the agonizing depths of the hurt, the camera shifted wildly. Jamal stepped into the frame, snatching the phone directly from Chloe's hand. My ex-husband of 3 years looked exactly like the corporate caricature he had spent the last decade desperately trying to become. He was 38, wearing a tailored cashmere sweater that easily cost more than my monthly rent, casually swirling an expensive glass of imported bourbon in his hand. He looked down his nose at the camera, a deeply familiar gesture of absolute condescension that instantly replaced my maternal pain with a cold, rising, and fiercely protective anger. "Look, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with that patronizing, dismissive tone he reserved entirely for me. "Brittany is stressing out about playing hostess this year. She wants everything to be absolutely perfect for the holiday photos. Plus, let us be completely honest here for a second. On your little government salary, you cannot afford the Aspen ski passes anyway. Just stay at the base. It is better for Chloe to be around success right now. She needs to see what a high-level lifestyle looks like." He took a slow, arrogant sip of his drink, admiring his own reflection in the screen. Jamal and I had met at a historically Black university when we were both broke, fiercely ambitious, and deeply in love. We built a life from absolutely nothing. I had worked 2 grueling jobs to support us while he coded his software in our tiny, cramped apartment. But the exact moment his private defense contracting firm Apex Solutions landed its first major government contract, the man I married vanished completely. He replaced his core values with imported sports cars, exclusive country club memberships, and a relentless, exhausting need to prove he was better than everyone else, especially the woman who had supported him when his bank account was empty. He had walked out on me 3 years ago, claiming we were simply moving in different directions. What he really meant was that my quiet, disciplined dedication to public service no longer fit his billionaire lifestyle aesthetic. Suddenly, a pale hand with perfectly manicured nails draped over Jamal's shoulder. Brittany leaned into the frame. She was 29, white, and possessed a uniquely toxic talent for delivering vicious insults wrapped securely in sickly sweet concern. She flashed a tight, perfectly engineered smile at the camera. "We just want Chloe to experience a real traditional family holiday," Maya Brittany said, tilting her head with fake performative sympathy. "I am sure you understand. It is just so important for her psychological development to see a cohesive, unbroken household. A real traditional family holiday." The microaggression was so loud it practically rang in my ears like a siren. Here was a woman who had been in my daughter's life for barely 2 years, boldly dictating what a real family looked like to an African-American mother who had sacrificed her entire youth to ensure her child never went hungry. Brittany rested her chin heavily on Jamal's shoulder, physically securing her claim on the screen, the man, and the entire situation. "We will send you plenty of pictures." She added her tone, suggesting she was doing me a massive charitable favor by tossing me digital breadcrumbs of my own daughter's childhood memories. Jamal did not even wait for my response. He just nodded, gave a dismissive, flippant wave with his bourbon glass, and said, "We will call you after the holidays. Do not wait up, Maya." The screen went pitch black. The call ended abruptly, violently, denying me the chance to say a single word of goodbye to my own child. I sat on the carpet for a long, intensely quiet time, staring at my dark phone screen. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had the time and privilege to be victims, and I was nobody's victim. The sheer audacity of Jamal dismissing my career as some low-level government charity work had always been a bitter, festering point of contention in our marriage. He constantly belittled my military service, assuming I spent my days pushing meaningless logistical paperwork at a front reception desk or organizing schedules for base supply runs. He had absolutely no idea what I actually did. He never bothered to ask because he was far too obsessed with his own reflection, and my strict security clearance legally prevented me from correcting his profound ignorance. I looked at the half-wrapped laptop resting on the floor. I thought about Chloe, manipulated, bought off with shiny objects and pressured into pushing me away so her father and his new wife could play pretend in a multi-million-dollar snowy cabin in Aspen. My face hardened into an emotionless mask. The warm, soft maternal love I had felt just 10 minutes ago evaporated, entirely replaced by the precise, calculating, and ruthlessly analytical coldness that made me exceptionally dangerous at my job. I stood up, stepped carefully over the silver Christmas wrapping paper, and walked straight to my bedroom closet. I bypassed the casual civilian clothes, the soft winter sweaters, and the holiday dresses I had planned to pack. I reached all the way into the very back, pulling out my freshly pressed military dress uniform. The dark fabric was crisp, immaculate, and heavy with unspoken authority. As I buttoned the jacket and meticulously adjusted my collar in the full-length mirror, the woman looking back at me was no longer just an insulted, discarded ex-wife. She was an apex predator assessing a massive threat. I stepped out into the biting December air, the pre-dawn chill slicing violently through the darkness. The drive to the military base was an exercise in aggressive, hyper-focused control. I gripped the steering wheel of my modest sedan, navigating the empty, frozen streets of the capital with surgical precision. The car heater blasted warm air, but I barely felt it. My mind was rapidly categorizing the interaction I had just survived, boxing up the personal pain of my daughter's rejection, and preparing for the brutal professional warfare that awaited me at the office. Jamal's arrogant, mocking words echoed endlessly in the confined space of the car. My little government salary. It was almost comical how spectacularly blind the man truly was. I approached the heavily fortified outer perimeter of the military installation just as the sun began to breach the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. Massive concrete barriers zigzagged aggressively across the entry lanes, designed specifically to stop a moving truck dead in its tracks. Armed military police in full tactical gear stood watch under the blinding, harsh glare of halogen floodlights, their weapons slung securely across their chests. I rolled down my window, letting the freezing winter wind whip violently into the car. A guard approached my vehicle, his expression stern, tired, and completely unyielding. I did not speak a word. I simply held up my identification badge. It was not a standard civilian visitor pass. It was not a basic administrative employee badge. It was a solid black credential card, embossed with a holographic federal seal. A Level 6 clearance badge that granted absolute access to subterranean rooms where the most dangerous, highly classified secrets of the nation were kept and analyzed. The guard scrutinized the card for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening slightly. He then immediately looked at my face. His posture transformed instantly. He snapped to attention, heels clicking together, delivering a crisp, perfectly executed salute. "Good morning, Director," he said respectfully, stepping back quickly and waving me through the security checkpoint without a single question. I returned the brief nod and drove through the massive reinforced steel gates. I parked in a designated, highly secure underground garage located entirely beneath a nondescript, windowless concrete building that most regular personnel on base assumed was merely an administrative annex. In reality, it was the central nervous system for the Defense Contract Audit Agency's cyber division. I walked purposefully toward the heavy steel blast doors of the SCIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. This was a highly controlled environment where personal cell phones were confiscated at the door, where outside electronic signals died instantly upon entry, and where the most classified financial intelligence in the country was actively dissected by the smartest minds in the government. 2 more heavily armed guards stood at the entrance. I handed over my personal phone, placing it in a secure locker, then pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner and stared directly into the retinal reader. A mechanical chime sounded softly, and the heavy vault door hissed open, unsealing with a loud, echoing rush of pressurized air. The command center inside was a sprawling, intense hive of activity, illuminated by the cool, artificial glow of dozens of massive digital monitors displaying global tracking data, complex financial algorithms, and encrypted communications networks. This was my absolute domain. I was not a desk clerk, pushing logistical paperwork or fetching coffee. I was the lead director of the cyber division. I commanded a specialized lethal task force of elite federal auditors, forensic accountants, and military cyber intelligence officers. My daily relentless objective was hunting down corrupt corporate defense contractors who believed they were smart enough, rich enough, or powerful enough to steal from the United States government. As I strode across the polished floor, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Analysts naturally stepped out of my way, offering respectful, slightly intimidated nods. I commanded this room not just because of the rank on my uniform, but because of the relentless, unforgiving precision with which I dismantled fraudulent corporate empires. I spotted him waiting for me near the central command desk. General Sterling was a towering, broad-shouldered African-American officer with a decorated, legendary career defined by ruthless integrity and a stare that could freeze boiling water. We had worked closely together for 4 grueling years, navigating the murky, deeply corrupt waters of international military contracting. He did not greet me with standard pleasantries or small talk. The moment he saw me approaching, he picked up a massive, thick, classified dossier bound in bright red security tape. He walked toward me, his expression exceptionally grave, the weight of his responsibility hanging heavy on his shoulders. "General," I said, coming to a sharp halt in front of him, standing at perfect attention. Sterling held out the heavy file, his intense eyes locking onto mine. "The federal fraud raid is green-lit, Maya," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that demanded absolute silence and attention from everyone in earshot. The final warrants were signed by a federal judge at 2 a.m. We have tactical breach teams heavily armed and on standby across 3 different states. We are ready to move on your direct command. But before we initiate the breach, you need to see the primary target. I frowned slightly, sensing a strange, uncharacteristic hesitation in his demeanor. General Sterling was not a man who hesitated. He was a man who crushed obstacles without a second thought. For him to pause now, right before authorizing a massive federal takedown, meant something in that file was highly irregular and potentially explosive. "What is the complication, sir?" I asked, reaching out and taking the heavy dossier from his hands. I broke the red security seal and flipped open the thick cover. The bright fluorescent lights of the SCIF reflected off the glossy printed pages within illuminating charts, bank records, and surveillance logs. Sterling tapped a massive, heavily redacted organizational chart located on the very first page. "It is not a complication of tactical execution, Maya," he said quietly, ensuring his commanding voice did not carry across the busy, crowded room. "It is a complication of personnel. I am giving you the opportunity to recuse yourself right now. Take a close look at the primary corporate entity." I shifted my gaze down to the document. Staring back at me, printed in bold, undeniable black ink at the top of the federal warrant, was the corporate logo for Apex Solutions. It was the exact same company that provided the lavish lifestyle, the expensive imported bourbon, and the multi-million-dollar Aspen cabin my daughter was currently sitting in. It was Jamal's company. My arrogant, dismissive ex-husband was the primary target of the largest federal fraud raid of the decade, and I was the one holding the trigger. The heavy steel door of the vault sealed shut with a pressurized hiss, locking the outside world away completely. I did not blink. I did not waver. I carried the red-banded dossier to my secure terminal and logged into the Department of Defense encrypted mainframe. The glowing monitors cast a pale blue light across my face as I began to tear into the digital footprint of Apex Solutions. Jamal always thought I pushed papers. He genuinely believed I spent my days filing travel vouchers for generals or managing supply chain logistics. He never understood that I commanded the digital battlefield where the Pentagon tracked its most classified assets. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking echoing in the quiet, climate-controlled room. I bypassed the standard public tax filings and went straight for the raw, unfiltered data streams routing through the Defense Contract Audit Agency servers. Within 20 minutes, the polished, untouchable facade of Jamal's billion-dollar defense firm began to crumble right in front of my eyes. This was not some minor clerical error. This was not a simple miscalculation of corporate taxes or a creative accounting trick. It was a massive, systemic, and highly coordinated theft. Apex Solutions had secured a highly lucrative government contract to run software security tests on next-generation military drones. These drones were specifically designed to provide aerial support and protect American soldiers in the most hostile territories on Earth. I pulled up the testing logs and cross-referenced them with the server load data from Jamal's company network. The servers were entirely dormant during the dates the tests were supposedly conducted. The logs were completely fabricated. They had never run the security protocols. They simply copied and pasted dummy code, stamped it as secure, and billed the Pentagon tens of millions of dollars for the work. Jamal was not just a white-collar thief. He was actively putting military personnel in extreme lethal danger just to pad his corporate profit margins. The cold analytical part of my brain took over entirely, shoving aside the hurt of the morning. I isolated the fraudulent invoices and tracked the outgoing federal wire transfers. The money did not go back into the company research and development funds as claimed. Instead, it bounced through a dizzying labyrinth of shell corporations, from Washington to the Cayman Islands, then to Luxembourg, and finally back into a series of highly obscured domestic accounts. Jamal thought he was an absolute genius, but he was leaving a digital blood trail that lit up my forensic monitors like a beacon. I tracked the stolen federal funds directly to his personal expenses, meticulously connecting the dirty money to his pristine public image. The numbers flashing across my screen were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on custom imported sports cars, exorbitant initiation fees for exclusive country clubs that historically excluded people who looked like us. He was buying his way into high society using blood money. Then a specific massive wire transfer caught my absolute attention. $3.2 million had been routed through a dummy corporation named Alpine Holdings just 6 months ago. I ran a quick property title search on the holding company, pulling the public real estate records. The address that popped up on my screen made my breath catch in my throat. It was a luxury custom-built ski property in Colorado. It was the Aspen Cabin, the exact cabin where my daughter Chloe was currently sleeping. The cabin Jamal had just mocked me for never being able to afford on my government salary. He could not afford it either. He had stolen it directly from the American taxpayers. Every extravagant gift, every luxury vacation, the entire lifestyle Brittany loved to flaunt on social media to make me look like the inferior, impoverished ex-wife was funded by federal treason. The rage I felt was no longer just the sting of a rejected mother. It was the righteous, burning fury of a federal investigator staring at a traitor. They had used stolen money to buy my daughter's affection, to make her look down on the honest living I provided, and to paint me as a failure. I needed the final piece of the puzzle before I could authorize the tactical breach. I needed the authorization signatures on those offshore accounts to prove exactly who was moving the stolen money and who knew about the fraud. I aggressively bypassed the corporate firewalls of the offshore bank and pulled the master signature cards for the Cayman shell accounts. I fully expected to see Jamal's arrogant, sprawling signature at the bottom of every fraudulent transfer. I found his signature exactly where I expected it to be. But my eyes darted to the secondary authorization line. Every single wire transfer over $1 million required a mandatory counter-signature. Jamal was not acting alone. He had a partner helping him launder the stolen military funds, someone he trusted explicitly, with the keys to his illegal empire. I isolated the secondary signature, enhanced the digital image to remove the compression artifacts, and ran it directly through the federal contractor database. The system analyzed the handwriting, matching it against thousands of corporate records and security clearance applications. A green light flashed on my monitor, indicating a perfect match, followed instantly by a high-resolution employee badge photo. The face staring back at me made my blood run absolutely cold. It was Trevor, Brittany's 32-year-old brother, the man Jamal had recently appointed as his chief financial officer. The entire new family was in on the grift. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit Maya with the force of a physical blow. She pushed her chair back from the encrypted terminal, the pale blue light of the monitors reflecting off the rigid shock in her eyes. It was not just Jamal skimming off the top of a government contract to line his own pockets. He had integrated his new wife's family directly into the criminal enterprise. Trevor was not just a naive brother-in-law hired for a cushy corporate title. As chief financial officer, his signature was the mandatory secondary authorization on every single fraudulent offshore wire transfer. He was actively laundering stolen Pentagon money through the Cayman Islands to finance Jamal and Brittany's luxurious charade. The entire new family was deeply structurally complicit in the grift. Maya looked back in the glowing screens, her analytical mind immediately calculating the operational reality of what came next. She knew exactly how federal tactical teams executed high-level fraud raids. They did not knock politely on the front door and hand over a piece of paper. They arrived in heavily armored tactical vehicles under the cover of absolute darkness. They breached properties with battering rams and stun grenades. They flooded living rooms with blinding tactical lights, screaming orders, and forcing everyone to the ground at gunpoint, while they secured the premises and seized electronic devices. The vivid, terrifying image of heavily armed agents swarming the secluded Aspen cabin while Chloe was asleep upstairs sent a wave of violent nausea crashing through Maya's stomach. Chloe was only 15 years old. She was just a teenager who desperately wanted a normal family holiday. A girl who had spent the last 3 grueling years caught in the emotional crossfire of a deeply bitter divorce. Jamal had spent every single day of those 3 years meticulously curating his image as the fun, generous, perfect father. He bought her concert tickets, ignored her curfews, and casually dropped thousands of dollars on weekend shopping sprees. He had systematically and intentionally painted Maya as the enemy. To Chloe, Maya was the rigid, unyielding military mother who cared more about protocol, discipline, and rules than her own daughter's happiness. Jamal had effectively weaponized Maya's demanding government schedule against her, feeding Chloe a toxic narrative that her mother's absence was a selfish career choice rather than a dedicated sacrifice for public service. If Maya pushed the button tonight to authorize the federal strike, she would not just be doing her job as a cyber intelligence director. She would be confirming every horrible, manipulative lie Jamal had ever told their daughter. She would permanently become the monster who literally sent armed federal agents with assault rifles to destroy a family Christmas. Jamal would look at Chloe over the wreckage of the raid and say that her mother was simply a bitter, jealous ex-wife who abused her government power because she hated seeing them happy. The psychological damage to Chloe would be catastrophic and irreversible. Maya stared blindly at the blinking cursor on the authorization screen, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the keyboard. A paralyzing internal conflict completely derailed her focus. The servers at Apex Solutions were currently routing a massive data migration. Trevor was actively shifting the stolen Pentagon funds through the Cayman shell accounts, layering the transactions through complex digital tunnels to make the money disappear permanently by morning. If Maya delayed the raid until after the holiday, until Chloe was safely back on a plane to Washington, the money would be entirely gone. The offshore servers would be wiped clean. Jamal and Trevor would walk away with millions in stolen taxpayer dollars. Worse, the compromised drone security protocols would remain unaddressed in the Pentagon database, leaving active American soldiers completely exposed to lethal enemy hacking in hostile territories. General Sterling stood silently beside her terminal, his imposing presence casting a long, heavy shadow over her desk. He had commanded platoons in active war zones, and he possessed an uncanny, razor-sharp ability to read the exact breaking point of his officers. He watched Maya closely, seeing the uncharacteristic hesitation in her posture. He knew the target was her ex-husband. He knew her daughter was currently inside the primary breach location. He understood the agonizing weight of the dilemma crushing her. Sterling placed a heavy, grounding hand on her shoulder, breaking her out of her paralyzed state. He leaned down, his deep baritone voice low and uncompromising amid the chaotic hum of the cyber division. He told her that a commanding officer cannot operate effectively when compromised by blood. The tactical risk was escalating with every passing second that the offshore accounts remained active. He ordered Maya to step away from the terminal and leave the sterile vault. He told her to go into the secure adjacent ready room, the quiet antechamber where personal effects were stored during classified shifts, to clear her head. He gave her exactly 10 minutes. She had two choices. She could walk back into the vault, push the button, and execute the multi-state strike, completely destroying her ex-husband and breaking her daughter's heart in the process. Or she could officially recuse herself right now, pass the operational command to her deputy director, and let someone else pull the trigger while she drove home with her conscience clear. Maya walked out of the vault, the heavy steel blast doors sealing shut behind her with a loud, pressurized hiss. She sat down alone at a metal table in the stark white ready room. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the buzzing warfare of the command center. She stared at the digital clock mounted on the sterile wall. The red numbers ticked downward with agonizing, merciless slowness. 8 minutes, 7 minutes. She buried her face in her hands, trapped in a suffocating nightmare. Recusing herself felt like a cowardly betrayal of her oath to her country and the soldiers relying on that drone software. But authorizing the violent raid felt like an unforgivable betrayal of her only child. She closed her eyes, trying to measure the cost of national justice against the cost of her daughter's permanent trauma. 6 minutes. Then a sharp, continuous, vibrating buzz violently shattered the quiet of the room. Maya lifted her head. On the metal table beside her secured locker, her personal cell phone lit up the dark corner of the ready room. She stared at the glowing screen, her breath catching sharply in her throat. A new message notification flashed across the locked display. It was a text message from Brittany. Maya picked up the device. The screen was glaringly bright in the dim, sterile environment of the secure ready room. She swiped her thumb across the glass to unlock it, her heart pounding a heavy, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The notification expanded, filling her screen with a high-resolution photograph followed by a short block of text. The image was a masterpiece of manufactured domestic perfection. Chloe was standing in the center of a massive vaulted living room. Behind her floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the snow-covered Colorado mountains, perfectly illuminated by outdoor landscape lighting. A roaring fire blazed in a towering stone fireplace that looked like it belonged in a luxury ski resort brochure. Chloe was smiling, though it was that tight, practiced smile she used when she was being told to pose. In her hands, she held a brand-new custom-designed snowboard. Even through the phone screen, Maya could recognize the elite branding and the high-end bindings. It was a piece of professional winter sports equipment that easily retailed for over $2,000. Below the photograph was a message from Brittany. "Do not worry, Maya. We are giving her the life you could not afford to Merry Christmas." Maya read the words once. She read them a second time. She stared at the exclamation points, feeling the dripping, condescending venom behind the seemingly cheerful holiday greeting. Brittany had spent the last 2 years trying to systematically erase Maya from Chloe's life by drowning the teenager in a tsunami of extravagant gifts. Brittany treated wealth like a weapon, using it to bludgeon Maya's modest, disciplined lifestyle. She genuinely believed that dropping $2,000 on a piece of fiberglass and metal made her a superior maternal figure. Maya stood in the absolute silence of the room, her eyes locked on the image of her daughter holding that expensive board. 5 minutes ago, Maya had been suffocating under the crushing weight of maternal guilt. She had been ready to walk away from her duty, ready to hand her command over to a subordinate, just to protect Chloe from the trauma of an armed federal raid. She had been terrified of ruining her daughter's Christmas. But as Maya stared at the custom snowboard, the guilt vanished. It evaporated into the cold, recycled air of the facility, leaving behind a sharp, breathtaking clarity. Maya did not see a generous holiday gift from a wealthy stepmother. She saw forensic evidence. Her analytical mind, trained to trace complex financial crimes across the globe, instantly connected the dots. She equated the $2,000 price tag of that snowboard to the exact amount of money Jamal and Trevor had skimmed off the latest drone security patch. She looked at the towering stone fireplace in the background of the photo and realized that the custom masonry was paid for by fabricated testing logs. She looked at the massive windows overlooking the aspen pines and knew that the glass was bought with funds stolen directly from the United States Department of Defense. Every single thing in that photograph, the roaring fire, the expensive winter gear, the luxury cabin itself, was quite literally stolen property. The classist insult Brittany intended to deliver morphed instantly into a confession of federal treason. Brittany thought she was sending a petty, triumphant text message to a broke, bitter ex-wife working a low-level government job. She had absolutely no idea she was sending photographic evidence of money laundering to the lead director of the Defense Contract Audit Agency just minutes before a multi-agency strike. Jamal was not just a terrible husband who had traded his core values for a sports car. He was a profound national security threat. He had compromised the encrypted software protocols of military drones, putting active American soldiers in direct lethal danger just to inflate his corporate profit margins. And the absolute reckless hubris of the man was staggering. He had brought their innocent 15-year-old daughter into a house purchased with laundered federal money. He had made Chloe an unwitting beneficiary of a massive criminal syndicate surrounding her with stolen luxury while lecturing Maya about the importance of being around success. Maya's jaw tightened until her teeth ached. The quiet, disciplined public servant Jamal loved to mock was gone. Brittany's text message had done exactly what General Sterling had hoped the 10-minute break would do. It had completely severed Maya's emotional hesitation. There was no more internal conflict. There was only the mission, the law, and the absolute necessity of tearing Jamal's fraudulent empire down to its very foundation. She turned the phone screen off, plunging the device into darkness. She opened the small reinforced steel locker assigned to her on the wall. She placed the phone inside, pushed the heavy metal door shut, and turned the key. The loud metallic click echoed with absolute finality. She left her identity as a conflicted, insulted mother inside that locker. She stepped away from it as the commanding officer of a federal task force. Maya walked back out into the corridor and approached the heavy steel blast doors of the vault. She pressed her thumb to the biometric scanner and leaned into the retinal reader. The mechanical locks disengaged and the door hissed open. The command center was waiting in suffocating silence. Dozens of highly trained agents and forensic analysts sat at their stations, their eyes shifting toward her as she entered the room. General Sterling was standing exactly where she had left him, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The digital countdown clock mounted on the wall above the main surveillance monitors showed exactly 45 seconds remaining before her window to recuse herself closed. General Sterling looked at her face. He did not need to ask what she had decided. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders and the dark, unyielding focus in her eyes. The hesitation that had clouded her judgment 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that commanded absolute respect from every person in the room. Maya did not stop at her personal terminal. She walked straight to the center command desk, stepping up to the primary communication console that connected directly to the tactical staging areas across the country. On the massive screens above her, the GPS coordinates of Jamal's corporate headquarters in Washington and the stolen luxury cabin in Aspen glowed in bright tactical red. She picked up the encrypted communication headset. She looked at the thermal imaging showing the federal breach teams holding their positions in the freezing snow just yards away from the cabin doors. She thought of Jamal swirling his expensive bourbon. She thought of Brittany's fake, condescending smile. Maya pressed the transmission button, her voice slicing through the silent room with absolute, terrifying authority. The words had barely left my mouth before the command center erupted into a symphony of highly coordinated, lethal precision. General Sterling gave a single sharp nod, stepping back to allow me complete operational control. This was my division, my investigation, and now my tactical execution. The digital clock on the primary display flipped to 12:30 in the morning. It was officially Christmas Eve. On the massive central monitors, the digital map of the United States lit up with active tactical channels. I stood at the command console, my posture rigid, my voice devoid of any emotion as I directed the cyber offensive. The physical raids were only half the battle. If Jamal or Trevor received even a fraction of a second of warning, they could hit a kill switch and wipe the Cayman accounts, entirely vanishing the stolen Pentagon funds into the dark web. I was not going to give them that second. I ordered the cyber task force to initiate the protocol. Across the room, dozens of elite forensic hackers unleashed a synchronized digital assault on Apex Solutions. We did not just lock them out. We severed their entire corporate infrastructure from the global financial system. I watched the live data streams as we systematically froze Jamal's domestic bank accounts, his stock portfolios, and the holding company that owned the Aspen cabin. Then we hit the offshore accounts. My team bypassed the secondary security walls of the Cayman Bank, utilizing federal emergency authorization codes to seize control of the routing numbers Trevor had been using. Within 90 seconds, every single dollar of the stolen military funds was locked down by the United States government. Jamal was suddenly bankrupt. He just did not know it yet. With the digital perimeter secured, the physical breaches commenced. On the left monitor, a live encrypted feed from a drone hovering over downtown Washington displayed the corporate headquarters of Apex Solutions. It was a towering structure of sleek black glass, a monument to Jamal's unchecked arrogance. A convoy of black unmarked armored vehicles surrounded the building. Federal Bureau of Investigation and Criminal Investigation Division agents spilled out onto the empty pavement. I watched the tactical teams breach the front lobby, moving with swift, terrifying efficiency. They bypassed the civilian security guards, flooding the executive suites and server rooms. My earpiece crackled with the crisp voice of the DC tactical lead confirming they had secured the mainframe. They were currently seizing hard drives, physical ledgers, and taking the overnight skeleton crew into custody for questioning. Trevor's office was thoroughly dismantled. The financial architect of the treasonous grift was officially out of business. But my eyes were glued to the right monitor. This screen displayed a high-altitude thermal imaging feed directly above the snowy, isolated mountains of Aspen, Colorado. The luxury cabin sat in the center of the frame, surrounded by dense, freezing pine trees. Through the thermal lens, the massive stone fireplace radiated a bright, pulsing white heat. The rest of the cabin glowed with the warm signatures of the people inside. My hands gripped the edge of the metal command console. The leather material of my gloves creaked slightly under the intense pressure. I was a mother watching the exact coordinates of her only child through a military targeting system. I could see 3 distinct human heat signatures moving inside the property. 2 adult figures were located in the expansive master suite on the ground floor. Jamal and Brittany. They were likely asleep, wrapped in high-thread count sheets, bought with blood money, completely oblivious to the federal hammer about to drop on their heads. The third heat signature was smaller, isolated in a second-floor bedroom. Chloe. She was curled up in bed, probably exhausted from a day of forced family bonding and fake smiles, resting her head just down the hall from the new $2,000 snowboard that had sealed her father's fate. My chest tightened with a vicious, suffocating ache. I was the architect of the nightmare that was about to rip through that house. I was the one sending armed men into the dark to drag her father out in handcuffs. But the calculating, relentless federal director inside me knew this was the only way to protect her. Jamal had built a house of cards on a foundation of treason, and it was going to collapse eventually. It was better that I controlled the demolition, ensuring Chloe was entirely insulated from the legal fallout, rather than letting the entire corrupt empire crash down on her randomly. Through the thermal feed, I watched the perimeter of the cabin carefully. In the dark, freezing woods surrounding the property, a dozen highly trained federal agents moved silently through the deep snow. They were heavily armed, wearing tactical winter gear, their heat signatures minimized, but still visible as they completely encircled the cabin. There was no escape route. Jamal had nowhere to run. The tactical lead in Aspen radioed into the command center. His voice was a low, steady whisper in my earpiece, reporting that all teams were in position and awaiting the final green light. General Sterling stepped up beside me. He looked at the thermal signatures, fully understanding the personal agony warring with my professional duty. He did not say a word. He simply offered a brief, respectful nod, acknowledging the immense weight of the command. I did not flinch. I stared directly at the glowing white signature of the master bedroom. I pressed the transmission button on the console and delivered the order. Breach. The thermal monitor lit up instantly. A bright, momentary bloom of heat exploded at the front entrance of the cabin as the tactical team utilized a specialized breaching tool to utterly destroy the reinforced locks. The heavy wooden doors were blown entirely off their hinges. Federal agents flooded into the ground floor of the cabin like a dark, relentless tide. Through the thermal imaging, the chaotic, violent choreography of a high-risk raid played out in stark silhouettes. I watched the agents swarm the master bedroom. The 2 adult heat signatures jerked violently upright. The raid team moved with overwhelming force, subduing the targets immediately. Jamal and Brittany were being forced to the floor, their hands secured behind their backs. The illusion of their billionaire lifestyle was shattered in a matter of seconds, replaced by the cold, hard reality of federal custody. My eyes immediately darted to the second floor. A secondary tactical unit was moving rapidly up the stairs. I held my breath, the silence in the SCIF, suddenly feeling absolute and deafening. I watched the agents approach the bedroom where the smallest heat signature was located. They breached the door. I knew the protocol. I knew they would secure the room, identify the non-combatant minor, and ensure she was separated from the hostile targets. I knew they would lower their weapons and attempt to de-escalate the situation for her. But watching the thermal outline of my 15-year-old daughter sitting up in bed, instantly surrounded by federal agents in full tactical gear, sent a physical jolt of pure maternal terror straight through my heart. The secure line crackled again. The Aspen tactical lead reported that the primary targets were secured and the premises were under full federal control. The operation was a complete flawless success. Jamal's corrupt empire was officially dead. General Sterling exhaled a long, heavy breath, the tension in his broad shoulders finally releasing. He turned to me, offering a look of profound, unwavering professional respect. We had just executed the most significant defense fraud takedown of the decade. I stepped back from the command console. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the operation began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I had done my job. I had protected the military supply chain. I had dismantled the threat. But I was still a mother who had just authorized a raid on her own child's location. I needed my phone. I needed to call the on-site agents and demand to speak directly to Chloe to assure her that she was safe to explain the terrifying reality of what was happening before Jamal could twist the narrative. I turned away from the massive monitors and walked briskly out of the main vault, heading straight for the secure ready room. I went directly to the reinforced metal locker where I had stored my personal belongings. I turned the key, pulled the heavy door open, and reached inside. The encrypted line on the command desk back in the vault stayed entirely silent, the tactical teams managing the aftermath of the breach without needing further direction. But the moment my fingers brushed against the cold screen of my personal cell phone, the device suddenly vibrated violently against the metal shelving. The harsh, jarring ringtone pierced the quiet of the ready room, loud and demanding. I pulled the phone out and stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID flashed a single name: Chloe. I snatched the phone from the metal shelf, my thumb swiping across the glass with a desperate adrenaline-fueled urgency. The sterile, quiet atmosphere of the secure ready room vanished the exact instant the call connected. It was instantly replaced by a solid wall of chaotic, terrifying sound. I could hear heavy tactical boots stomping aggressively across expensive hardwood floors. Deep, commanding voices echoed through the massive vaulted ceilings of the Aspen cabin, barking clear, sharp orders to secure the perimeter and keep hands visible. The unmistakable sharp crackle of tactical radios hissed constantly in the background. It was the absolute, highly organized violence of a federal raid happening in real time, transmitted directly into my ear. "Mom!" Her voice was a ragged, high-pitched scream completely fractured by sheer terror. "Mom, please!" The sound of my daughter crying hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. It instantly stripped away the cold, calculating armor of the Cyber Division director and left only the frantic, desperate mother underneath. The tactical monitors and the federal warrants faded away. All that existed in the world was the sound of my 15-year-old child, trapped in a nightmare. "Chloe, I am right here," I said. I kept my voice incredibly steady, pushing every single ounce of grounding maternal authority I possessed into those words. I could not let her hear my fear. I had to be her anchor. "Listen to my voice, Chloe. You are completely safe. Do exactly what the agents tell you to do. Keep your hands where they can see them. Nobody is going to hurt you." "There are men everywhere," she sobbed hysterically. Her breath was catching painfully in her throat as she struggled to form coherent words. "They have huge guns, Mom. They kicked the front doors completely down. They threw Dad onto the floor. They are tearing the whole house apart. They took his computers. They took Trevor's briefcase. They took Brittany's phone. They took everything." She took a jagged, gasping breath, her voice dropping into a confused, terrified whisper. "Mom, they said they were federal agents. Why did the Pentagon just call Dad?" The Pentagon calling Dad. That specific detail meant General Sterling's primary task force had just officially seized Apex Solutions headquarters in Washington and delivered the formal classified indictment notification directly to Jamal's secure line. They had delivered it only to find the line already confiscated by the breach team standing in his living room. It was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation that his entire fraudulent empire had officially burned to the ground. The trap had snapped shut perfectly. I opened my mouth to tell Chloe that I knew exactly who the men were. I wanted to tell her that I had personally ensured the specific tactical team moving into her second-floor bedroom was highly trained to protect non-combatant minors. I wanted to explain everything, but I never got the chance to say the words. A sudden violent scuffle echoed harshly through the tiny speaker of my phone. I heard a gruff, authoritative federal voice shouting a direct order to stay on the ground, followed instantly by the heavy thud of a physical struggle. "Give me the phone." The voice was panicked, breathless, but completely unmistakable. Jamal. He must have realized who Chloe had managed to dial. In a moment of sheer, desperate hubris, he must have lunged for the device while the agents were busy cataloging the seized electronics and clearing the massive living space. "Maya." His voice was a frantic, breathless hiss, vibrating with a wild, desperate energy. But even now, even while surrounded by highly trained, heavily armed federal agents in his multi-million-dollar stolen living room, the absolute core of his narcissistic arrogance remained entirely intact. He was bleeding out legally, professionally, and financially, yet he still looked at me as his inferior subordinate. "Maya, you need to listen to me right now," he barked. His tone instantly shifted back into that patronizing, dismissive command he had weaponized against me for the last decade. "Some massive, idiotic, bureaucratic mistake has just been made. The FBI just breached my cabin. They have me in zip ties on my own floor. They are actively seizing every single electronic device in the house. My entire corporate network is locked down. Every single bank account I own is completely frozen." I stood in the quiet ready room holding the phone to my ear in absolute unyielding silence. I did not interrupt him. I did not defend myself. I let him hang himself with his own desperate, arrogant words. "You work at the base," he demanded, his voice rising in pitch as genuine panic began to completely override his polished corporate facade. "You push papers for these people. You know the logistical protocols and the chain of command. I need you to use whatever low-level base connections you have and find out exactly who authorized this unmitigated disaster. Call your supervisors. Call the base commander. Tell them you are speaking to Jamal, the CEO of Apex Solutions. Tell them they have breached the wrong target, and my lawyers will absolutely destroy them by morning." He was genuinely entirely blind. It was almost staggering to witness. He had spent so many years belittling my career, dismissing my uniform, and convincing himself that my public service was just a pathetic, low-paying charity job. He could not even begin to fathom the reality of the situation unfolding around him. He truly thought I was a receptionist. He thought I was a minor clerk fetching coffee for the real decision-makers. He was ordering me to secure his salvation the exact same way he ordered his assistants to manage his calendar. "Do not just stand there in silence, Maya," he screamed into the phone. The sound of an agent firmly ordering him to surrender the device and place his face back on the floor echoed loudly in the background. "My company holds a $50 million contract with the Pentagon. This is a targeted illegal harassment campaign by some incompetent federal agency. I need you to get on your little computer log into your basic administrative portal and make yourself useful for once in your life. Fix this." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his words washed over me, but it did not make me angry. The blinding rage I had felt earlier in the evening was gone. The bitter sting of the morning FaceTime call was erased. The disgust at seeing Brittany flaunt that stolen $2,000 snowboard had completely evaporated. All of the deeply personal hurt was replaced by a profound, glacial, and absolute calm. I had spent a decade shrinking myself to fit into Jamal's massive shadow. I had endured 3 years of brutal post-divorce microaggressions. I had watched him manipulate our daughter with stolen wealth while treating my honest, disciplined sacrifice like a tragic joke. He had repeatedly tried to rewrite the narrative of our family, aggressively painting himself as the unparalleled corporate success and me as the bitter, jealous failure. I walked slowly across the ready room. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders squared. The heavy, dark fabric of my military dress uniform was crisp and immaculate under the harsh fluorescent lights. I looked at my reflection in the small mirror mounted on the locker door. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was not a clerk. She was not a low-level paper pusher scrambling to appease an arrogant ex-husband. She was the apex predator of the digital battlefield. She was the lead director of the Defense Contract Audit Agency Cyber Division, and she had just cleanly decapitated a massive national security threat. I listened to Jamal taking one final ragged breath, clearly preparing to launch into another desperate string of arrogant, condescending commands. I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. My voice was low, incredibly precise, and cold enough to freeze boiling water. It sliced right through his frantic, pathetic panic with surgical, devastating accuracy. "I do not need to call my commanders Jamal," I said, letting the absolute crushing weight of reality settle directly onto his shoulders. "I am the commander who signed the warrant. Merry Christmas." I pulled the phone away from my ear, entirely severing the connection before he could even begin to process the catastrophic magnitude of my words. I tapped the screen, disconnecting the call instantly. The silence of the ready room rushed back in heavy, pure, and incredibly satisfying. I locked the phone back in the secure drawer. I turned around and walked back through the heavy steel blast doors into the command center. I looked at General Sterling, giving him a single resolute nod. The operation was over. The fraud was dismantled. The arrogant billionaire had just been utterly destroyed by the quiet public servant he had spent his entire life underestimating. The pale, freezing gray of Christmas morning broke over the jagged peaks of Aspen, casting long, harsh shadows across the snow. Jamal stood on the icy pavement outside the local Federal Processing Annex, shivering violently in the designer cashmere tracksuit he had been wearing when the breach teams kicked his doors in. His wrists still ached from the tight plastic restraints. He had just been released pending a formal federal indictment, cut loose into the freezing Colorado air with nothing but his phone, his wallet, and a suffocating sense of disbelief. A few feet away, Brittany huddled on a concrete bench. She was weeping loudly, her arms wrapped tightly around her shivering frame. She was wearing an oversized luxury ski coat, hastily thrown over her silk nightgown, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled, disheveled mess. Beside her sat Chloe, staring blankly at the snow-covered ground. The 15-year-old looked utterly traumatized, her eyes red and swollen from hours of relentless crying. The shock of being ripped from her bed by armed agents in tactical gear had left her completely hollowed out. Jamal paced the length of the icy sidewalk, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen of his phone. He dialed the direct emergency line for his private aviation broker. He held the phone to his ear, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ground together. The line clicked open. A polite, highly trained customer service voice answered. Jamal did not wait for a greeting. He barked his orders, his voice dripping with his usual entitled authority. He demanded his Gulfstream be fueled and prepped on the Aspen tarmac immediately. He needed a direct, non-stop flight back to Washington. The voice on the other end shifted from polite to rigidly professional. The broker informed Jamal that Elite Aviation Charters had received a direct, non-negotiable directive from the United States Treasury Department. His corporate account was flagged. His personal retainers were frozen. The broker stated clearly that they could not legally accept his booking, authorize a flight, or process any transaction associated with his name. Jamal screamed into the receiver, threatening lawsuits, demanding to speak to the CEO, and citing his net worth. The broker simply stated that the decision was final and disconnected the call. Jamal pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the blank screen in absolute horror. The reality of his situation began to pierce through his blinding arrogance. It was not a glitch. It was a complete financial blackout. He immediately opened his banking applications. The screen loaded, displaying a series of stark red error messages. Access denied. Account suspended. Please contact your financial institution. He was locked out of everything. Brittany let out a dramatic, shuddering sob, pulling her coat tighter around her neck. She looked up at Jamal, her mascara smeared down her cheeks. She complained that she was freezing, that her toes were completely numb, and that they needed to go back to the cabin immediately. She demanded a hot shower and her legal team. Jamal snapped at her, his voice harsh and echoing in the quiet morning air. He informed her that the cabin was an active federal crime scene. They could not go back. The FBI had seized the property, the vehicles, and every single piece of electronic equipment inside. They were stranded on the sidewalk like vagrants. He looked at Chloe, seeing the profound confusion and terror in his daughter's eyes. Jamal was a master manipulator, a corporate predator who had built an entire career on twisting the truth to serve his own narrative. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He had to control the story before the reality of his treason sank into his daughter's mind. He crouched down in front of Chloe, blocking her view of the street, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. He reached out and placed his hands on her shoulders. He softened his voice, pouring a thick, manufactured layer of paternal concern over his words. He told Chloe that she needed to listen to him very carefully. He swore that everything that had happened that night was a massive illegal mistake. He looked his traumatized daughter in the eye and began to systematically spin a web of aggressive, calculated lies. He told Chloe that her mother had completely lost her mind. He explained that Maya was just a low-level government bureaucrat who had spent the last 3 years drowning in bitter, unchecked jealousy. He claimed that Maya could not handle seeing them happy. He insisted that seeing the photograph of the expensive new snowboard had finally pushed Maya over the edge. Jamal painted a vivid, fictitious picture of Maya abusing her minor security clearance to illegally hack into the federal dispatch system. He convinced Chloe that her mother had weaponized a federal agency to swat their luxury cabins simply to ruin their Christmas morning. He framed the entire multi-agency raid as the petty, vindictive prank of a jealous, broke ex-wife trying to punish a successful man. Brittany immediately caught on to the narrative, her survival instincts kicking in. She leaned closer to Chloe, resting a manicured hand on the teenager's knee. Brittany fueled the fire with perfect, practiced victimhood. She told Chloe that Maya was a dangerous, unstable woman. She cried about the trauma of having guns pointed at them, asking Chloe how a real mother could ever subject her own child to such terror just to settle a petty financial score. Brittany shook her head, whispering that Maya belonged in a psychiatric ward for pulling such a cruel, vindictive stunt. Chloe looked back and forth between her father and her stepmother. Her mind was exhausted, her emotional defenses completely shattered. The seed of doubt was firmly planted. Jamal's aggressive gaslighting was a suffocating blanket designed to entirely obscure the truth. He sounded so absolutely certain, so righteously indignant, that the terrified teenager had no choice but to absorb his twisted version of reality. Jamal stood up, his arrogance fully restored by the successful manipulation of his daughter. He was not a defeated criminal. He was the victim of a jealous government clerk. He pulled his wallet from his pocket. He bypassed the heavy metal black cards and the corporate platinum accounts. He dug into the back slot and pulled out a basic, high-interest commercial credit card he had opened years ago for a minor shell company. It was not tied to the Apex Solutions central network. He flagged down a passing local taxi, throwing a crumpled $50 bill at the driver. He ordered the man to take them directly to the commercial terminal of the Aspen airport. 30 minutes later, the CEO of Apex Solutions stood at a standard commercial ticket counter, subjected to the ultimate humiliation. He was forced to purchase 3 economy-class tickets on a crowded, desperate holiday flight back to Washington. He stood in the slow-moving security line, taking off his designer shoes and placing them in a plastic bin just like everyone else. The sheer degradation of flying commercial coach burned a hole straight through his monumental ego. As they sat in the cramped, noisy terminal waiting to board, Jamal's panic fully crystallized into a cold, venomous fury. He gripped his boarding pass, his knuckles turning white. He looked at Brittany, who was complaining loudly about the smell of the terminal, and then at Chloe, who was curled into a tight ball in the uncomfortable plastic chair. Jamal leaned forward, his voice a dark, lethal promise. He vowed that the second this commercial flight touched down in Washington, he was not going to call his lawyers. He was going to march directly onto the military base. He was going straight into the Defense Contract Audit Agency. He swore he would rip Maya from her pathetic little desk, drag her in front of her commanding officers, and personally ensure she was stripped of her badge, fired, and thrown in federal prison for abusing her power. Jamal's rented sedan screeched to a halt outside the heavily fortified gates of the Defense Contract Audit Agency command base. He kicked the door open, before the vehicle even completely stopped his expensive leather shoes, hitting the freezing Washington pavement with a heavy, aggressive thud. Brittany scrambled out behind him, wrapping her oversized luxury coat tightly against the biting wind, her face pale and drawn from the humiliating commercial flight they had just endured. The towering steel fences and armed sentries at the checkpoint usually fed Jamal's monumental ego, serving as a reminder of the exclusive high-level world he operated in as a top-tier defense contractor. Today, he viewed these security measures merely as a minor, irritating hurdle, keeping him from his vengeance. He marched directly toward the primary pedestrian turnstile, his chest puffed out, radiating the furious blind entitlement of a man who firmly believed the rules did not apply to him. He approached the automated entry point and aggressively slapped his encrypted VIP contractor badge against the biometric scanner. He expected the heavy metal bars to yield immediately, granting him the instant access he always commanded. Instead, the scanner let out a sharp, dissonant beep. A solid, glowing red light flashed across the display screen. Access denied. Jamal scowled, assuming it was a pathetic system error caused by incompetent base staff. He slammed the badge against the thick glass reader a second time, grinding the plastic into the sensor. The red light flashed again, accompanied by a much louder, continuous warning tone that echoed across the sterile concrete checkpoint. Rage boiled over into explosive action. He slammed his fist violently against the reinforced glass of the guard booth. He demanded the personnel inside open the gate instantly. He shouted his name, his corporate title, and his company's net worth, fully expecting the guards to cower, apologize, and comply with his demands. The response was instantaneous, but it was absolutely not compliance. Two military police officers stepped out of the security booth, their tactical rifles slung securely across their chests, their hands resting firmly on their sidearms. They did not recognize his supposed wealth or his ruined designer suit. They recognized a hostile, erratic threat attempting to breach a secure federal facility. The larger of the two guards stepped directly into Jamal's path. He placed a heavy, unyielding hand firmly against Jamal's chest and shoved him backward with enough calculated force to make him stumble precariously on the icy pavement. The guard issued a loud, sharp order commanding him to step away from the secure federal perimeter immediately or face immediate physical detention. Jamal's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He caught his balance and pointed a shaking, furious finger at the armed men. He screamed that he held a Level 5 security clearance and personally funded their federal paychecks through his tax brackets. He demanded they summon Maya to the gate right this second so he could personally terminate her employment and ruin her life. The heavy steel security door of the main annex clicked open. The mechanical sound was sharp enough to cut cleanly through Jamal's hysterical tirade. Maya stepped out into the freezing afternoon air. She was not the meek, accommodating woman he had bullied and belittled for a decade. She wore her immaculate military dress uniform, moving with a terrifying absolute authority that seemed to lower the temperature of the air around her. Two heavily armed federal agents flanked her, their eyes locked intensely on Jamal, ready to neutralize him the moment he twitched in the wrong direction. Maya stopped exactly 3 feet from the chain-link gate. She stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, her expression entirely devoid of emotion. She looked at Jamal, not as a former husband, not as a father to her child, but strictly as a neutralized target. Jamal gripped the freezing steel bars separating them, rattling the fence with his bare hands. He unleashed a torrent of pure venom, his voice cracking and echoing off the concrete walls of the checkpoint. He told Maya she had crossed a line she could never, ever uncross. He declared that she was a vindictive, unstable, jealous woman who had just ruined her own pathetic career out of pure, unadulterated spite. He gripped the metal harder and leaned his face close to the fence, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He vowed to take full physical and legal custody of Chloe by the end of the week. He promised to stand in front of a federal judge and use this exact early morning raid as undeniable documented proof that Maya was an unfit, reckless mother. He shouted that only a monster would intentionally traumatize her own child to settle a petty domestic grudge, and he would ensure the courts stripped her of every parental right she possessed. Brittany stepped up beside him, her perfectly manicured fingernails hooking through the chain-link fence. She sneered at Maya, her voice dripping with calculated malice. Brittany promised to call every single major media outlet in the country. She threatened to plaster Maya's face across national television, destroying her professional reputation completely. She vowed to paint Maya as a corrupt, bitter government bureaucrat who weaponized federal agencies against an innocent, successful American business owner simply because she was jealous of his new wife. Maya did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a single word of defense against their frantic, desperate noise. She simply maintained her glacial, unyielding stare. Slowly, deliberately, she reached inside the breast pocket of her uniform jacket and pulled out a single sheet of folded paper. She slid the document through the narrow gap in the steel fence, holding it out into the freezing wind. Jamal snatched the paper from her fingers, fully ready to tear it into pieces and throw it back in her face. He snapped the page open with a violent flick of his wrist. His furious rant died instantly in his throat. The sound of his own heavy breathing stopped. The document was a heavily redacted federal financial printout. The only visible text remaining on the page was a precise itemized list of 9 offshore routing numbers located in the Cayman Islands. Every single drop of blood drained from Jamal's face, leaving him a sickening ashen gray. His eyes darted wildly across the sequence of numbers, recognizing them instantly. He stared at the specific, highly classified bank codes that held his stolen Pentagon fortune, realizing in one devastating shattering second, that he had absolutely zero leverage left. The paper trembled violently in Jamal's hands. The blustering, arrogant billionaire who had just threatened to destroy my life was gone, replaced in a fraction of a second by a cornered, terrified criminal. He stared at the 9 redacted routing numbers, his eyes darting back and forth across the page, as if hoping the digits would magically rearrange themselves into a mistake. But there was no mistake. He knew those specific Cayman Island accounts. He knew that was the exact untraceable vault where he and Trevor had stashed the stolen Pentagon funds. And now he knew that I had entirely dismantled his financial fortress while he was sleeping. Brittany stopped screaming at the military guards and turned to look at her husband. She expected him to double down to unleash his highly paid legal team to put me in my place. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he had just been hollowed out from the inside. "Jamal!" she demanded, her voice shrill and grating in the crisp afternoon air. "What is that? What did she give you? Tell these guards to stand down right now." Jamal could not even form a coherent sentence. His mouth opened and closed silently. The illusion of his immense power, the very foundation he used to manipulate Chloe and belittle my career, was entirely shattered. The lead military police officer stepped forward, closing the distance with a heavy, intimidating presence. He ordered Jamal and Brittany to clear the federal perimeter immediately or face immediate arrest for trespassing on a secure military installation. For the first time in his life, Jamal did not argue. He did not threaten to call a senator. He simply dropped the piece of paper onto the icy pavement. He grabbed Brittany by the arm with a harsh, desperate grip and physically dragged her away from the security checkpoint. Brittany stumbled in her designer boots, screeching in protest and demanding answers, but Jamal ignored her. He pulled her toward the waiting rideshare vehicle that had dropped them off, moving with the frantic, humiliating urgency of a man running for his life. I stood perfectly still, flanked by the armed sentries, watching the taillights of their car disappear down the long access road. A profound, absolute quiet settled over the checkpoint. The oppressive shadow Jamal had cast over my life for the past decade was gone, leaving behind nothing but the cold, clean air of justice. I gave the guards a single nod of acknowledgement, signaling that the threat was neutralized. I turned on my heel, my dress shoes clicking sharply against the concrete, and began walking back toward the secure federal annex. I had barely taken 10 steps past the primary barricades when a sudden, erratic shuffling noise broke the silence. It came from the visitor parking area to my left, a sprawling lot sectioned off by massive reinforced concrete barriers. The sound was frantic, like heavy shoes slipping on the icy blacktop. My security detail instantly shifted their stances, their hands dropping defensively to their sidearms. I stopped, my posture rigid, scanning the shadows between the parked vehicles. A figure stumbled out from behind a towering concrete pillar. It was Trevor. Brittany's brother and the chief financial officer of Apex Solutions looked absolutely unrecognizable. The slick, manicured corporate executive who usually wore custom-tailored Italian suits and a perpetual smirk was entirely gone. Trevor looked like a hunted animal. He was wearing an expensive wool overcoat, but it was violently wrinkled and buttoned unevenly. Despite the freezing winter temperature, a heavy sheen of sweat coated his pale forehead. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He stepped out into the open, his hands raised high above his head in an immediate gesture of surrender. His eyes darted wildly toward the main road, scanning the horizon with pure, unadulterated paranoia to ensure Jamal's car was truly gone and not turning back. "Do not shoot," Trevor gasped, his voice cracking loudly in the cold air. He took another hesitant, trembling step toward the security checkpoint. "Please, I am unarmed. I need to speak with Director Maya immediately. Just give me 1 minute." The lead guard raised a hand, ordering Trevor to halt and keep his hands entirely visible. The guard looked at me silently, requesting orders. I narrowed my eyes, assessing the broken man standing in the snow. This was the architect of the financial fraud, the man who had actively laundered millions of stolen government dollars through offshore shell companies. He was the one who bought the luxury Aspen cabin and the expensive snowboards with blood money. And right now, he looked absolutely terrified. "Stand down," I instructed the guards, keeping my voice low and authoritative. I stepped past the security line, closing the distance until I stood just a few feet away from the trembling executive. I looked him up and down with absolute glacial contempt. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Trevor. Give me one good reason why I should not have these officers place you in federal custody right here on the pavement." Trevor swallowed hard. He was shivering so violently his teeth were practically chattering. He knew the FBI had raided his Washington office. He knew his servers were seized. He knew the offshore accounts were frozen. He knew that the Department of Defense was building a treason case that would put him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, overwhelming desperation. He lowered his hands, slowly reaching carefully into the inner pocket of his ruined overcoat. The guards tensed, but Trevor simply pulled out a small, encrypted black titanium hard drive. He held it out toward me, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it onto the ice. "I have the hidden hard drives," he whispered desperately. "I will give you everything on Jamal if you give me immunity." Maya did not immediately reach for the small black titanium drive. She let Trevor hold it out in the freezing wind for a long, agonizing moment. She watched his hand tremble, his expensive wool coat, doing nothing to stop the violent shivering racking his body. He was a corporate coward, a man used to hiding behind spreadsheets and legal loopholes. Out here on the icy pavement, facing the full, terrifying weight of the federal government, his nerve had entirely evaporated. Maya gave a sharp, subtle nod to the military police officer standing to her left. The guard stepped forward firmly, grasping Trevor by the bicep and marching him through the heavy steel security turnstile. Maya followed her expression, an unreadable mask of military discipline. They bypassed the standard public reception area of the visitor center, moving directly into the secure processing annex. The heavy reinforced doors locked behind them with a loud, definitive metallic clank. They entered Interrogation Room 4. It was a stark, windowless concrete box designed specifically to strip away a suspect's comfort. A heavy steel table bolted to the floor sat in the center, flanked by 3 rigid metal chairs. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, oppressive hum, casting harsh shadows across Trevor's pale, sweating face. He collapsed into the chair on the far side of the table, his shoulders hunched, his breathing shallow and erratic. Maya took the seat opposite him. She placed the black hard drive flat on the center of the steel table. She did not speak. She simply folded her hands and let the suffocating silence of the room crush whatever remaining resolve the chief financial officer of Apex Solutions possessed. Trevor cracked almost instantly. He leaned forward, his eyes darting frantically around the barren room. He began to beg, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He swore he never wanted to steal from the Defense Department. He claimed Jamal forced him into the scheme, threatening to fire him and ruin his career in the financial sector if he did not comply. Trevor desperately insisted that he was just a pawn, a captive employee following the demands of a tyrannical billionaire. He pointed a shaking finger at the hard drive, promising it contained every phantom invoice, every falsified ledger, and every offshore wire transfer log from the past 5 years. He begged Maya for a federal immunity deal, promising to testify in open court against his boss. Maya stared at him, her face radiating absolute zero. She informed him that she did not negotiate with federal thieves. She stated clearly that the Department of Defense already possessed the routing numbers for the Cayman Island accounts. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the cold steel table. She told Trevor that he had exactly one chance to save himself from spending the next 3 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He needed to provide the decryption key for the drive and explain the exact flow of the embezzled funds immediately. There would be no lawyers. There would be no immunity guarantees. There was only compliance, or he would be placed in a holding cell and formally charged with treason against the United States government. Trevor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The threat of treason broke him completely. He blurted out the 16-character alphanumeric password. Maya opened her secure military laptop, connected the drive, and bypassed the encryption. Rows of meticulously organized financial data flooded her screen. Trevor was a coward, but he was an exceptionally organized accountant. He began speaking rapidly, detailing the exact architecture of Jamal's fraud. He explained how Apex Solutions overbilled the Defense Contract Audit Agency for phantom tactical gear and non-existent logistical support. He detailed the network of domestic shell companies used to wash the stolen cash before it was wired to the offshore vaults. Maya scrolled through the digital ledgers, her eyes scanning the massive sums of stolen taxpayer money. She saw the corporate theft clearly, but she was looking for something much more specific. She stopped scrolling and looked up, pinning Trevor with a lethal glare. She demanded to know about the personal assets. She wanted the exact financial origin of the sprawling Aspen estate, the luxury vehicles, and the extravagant designer gifts Jamal had showered on their daughter Chloe. Trevor hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes dropping to the steel table. That minor hesitation was all Maya needed. She slammed her palm flat against the metal surface, the sharp, violent sound making Trevor jump in his seat. She commanded him to speak. Trevor threw his own flesh and blood directly under the bus to save himself. He confessed that Jamal was not the sole architect of the personal spending spree. It was Brittany. Trevor revealed, his voice shaking with terrified adrenaline, that his sister knew exactly where the money was coming from. Brittany was fully aware that the millions pouring into their accounts were stolen directly from federal military contracts. She did not care. In fact, she actively encouraged the embezzlement. Trevor leaned closer, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate honesty. He explained that Brittany had orchestrated a calculated psychological war against Maya. Brittany specifically demanded that Jamal use the stolen government funds to purchase the multi-million-dollar Aspen cabin. She was the one who curated the extravagant Christmas morning experience. She ordered the $1,000 designer snowboard, the luxury ski gear, and the first-class flights. The motivation was not simply greed. Trevor admitted that Brittany's primary goal was to completely alienate Chloe from Maya. She wanted to use the limitless stolen wealth to buy the teenager's affection and loyalty. Brittany aimed to paint Maya as a pathetic, broke government clerk who could never provide the glamorous lifestyle Chloe deserved. Trevor confessed that his sister wanted to legally and emotionally ice Maya out of her own daughter's life, using the stolen military funds to fund the ultimate domestic sabotage. Maya sat perfectly still as the horrifying truth washed over her. The betrayal ran so much deeper than corporate greed. Jamal and Brittany had weaponized stolen taxpayer money to execute a targeted malicious strike against her relationship with her child. The absolute calculating evil of Brittany's strategy chilled the blood in Maya's veins. She looked at Trevor, seeing the pathetic, sniveling accountant who had facilitated the destruction of her family for a paycheck. Trevor wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He pleaded again, asking if his confession was enough. He desperately asked if Maya would speak to the federal prosecutor on his behalf. Before Maya could formulate a response, a massive, violent commotion erupted in the adjacent visitor center lobby. The sound of shattering glass and heavy objects hitting the floor echoed through the cinderblock walls. A deep, furious voice roared over the noise, shouting Maya's name with murderous intent. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded across the linoleum floor of the public reception area, bypassing the initial security checkpoints. The heavy, reinforced door to the secure intake corridor was violently thrown open, slamming against the concrete wall with a deafening crash. Two military police officers were actively grappling with a man trying to drag him backward. It was Jamal. He had realized Trevor was missing from the rideshare vehicle. He had marched back to the gate fueled by a dangerous, erratic mix of panic and rage, and physically bullied his way into the public visitor lobby. He shoved past a civilian receptionist and stormed down the intake corridor. Jamal stood in the open doorway of the interrogation room, his designer coat torn, his face purple with absolute fury. The guards had his arms pinned behind his back, but his eyes were locked entirely on the scene inside the room. He saw his chief financial officer sitting across from his ex-wife. He saw the black titanium hard drive glowing brightly on the steel table. He saw the open military laptop displaying his most highly classified offshore financial ledgers. Jamal's eyes went wide. The arrogant entitlement vanished entirely, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his entire empire burn to the ground in real time. He locked eyes with Trevor, baring his teeth like a cornered predator, his voice echoing through the sterile federal building as he realized his own inner circle had just handed him a life sentence. The military police officers shoved Jamal backward with practiced, ruthless efficiency. They wrestled his thrashing, furious body out of the secure intake corridor and dumped him directly into the main public lobby of the visitor center, establishing a hard physical perimeter. Maya calmly removed the black titanium hard drive from her military laptop, secured the device in her uniform pocket, and stepped out into the lobby, gesturing for a terrified Trevor to move ahead of her. Jamal fought against the heavy hands pinning his shoulders to the reception desk. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He spat vicious threats at Trevor, promising to ruin him, promising to ensure he never worked in the financial sector again, swearing physical and legal annihilation. Trevor did not cower this time. The crushing reality of his situation had finally overridden his fear of his former boss. He stood behind the line of armed guards, his expensive overcoat still rumpled, and barked a harsh, hysterical laugh. He told Jamal to shut his mouth. He announced loudly that there was no company left to fire him from. Trevor pointed a shaking finger at Jamal and declared that the Cayman accounts were completely frozen, the shell companies were dismantled, and the federal prosecutors already had the decryption keys. He screamed that he was not going to spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a maximum security cell for a man who did not even know how to properly launder his own stolen cash. The heavy glass doors of the visitor center slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss. Brittany stumbled into the lobby, shivering violently and gasping for breath. She had finally managed to follow Jamal past the outer security turnstiles, completely ignoring the shouted warnings of the gate personnel. She stormed into the room, preparing to launch into another theatrical tirade, demanding hot coffee and an immediate apology from the base commander. Her manufactured outrage died instantly. She saw her husband physically restrained by federal agents. She saw her brother standing behind a line of tactical rifles, sweating and hyperventilating. Brittany marched toward Trevor, her designer boots clicking sharply against the polished linoleum. She grabbed his arm, demanding to know what he had done and where their legal team was. Trevor violently shook her hand off. He looked his sister directly in the eye and delivered the fatal blow to her fabricated reality. He told Brittany that it was over. He stated clearly that Maya had the routing numbers, the hard drives, and the exact paper trail linking the embezzled Defense Department funds directly to their personal checking accounts. He told her the money was gone, every single cent of it. The transformation was terrifying. The delicate, victimized, sweet stepmother persona that Brittany had weaponized for years completely shattered, leaving behind a cold, vicious predator backed into a corner. She slowly turned to face Jamal. The color drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking stark and hollow. The realization that she was now legally shackled to a broke, disgraced federal criminal snapped the last thread of her composure. She did not ask for clarification. She did not offer her husband comfort. She went completely feral. Brittany lunged toward the reception desk, her manicured fingers curling into claws. The military guards stepped forward, creating a physical barrier to keep her away from Jamal, but they could not stop the absolute venom pouring from her mouth. She screamed that Jamal was a pathetic, worthless fraud. The polished high society voice she usually affected was entirely gone, replaced by a harsh, grating shriek. She unleashed a torrent of vicious, classist insults, attacking the very core of his monumental ego. She called him a cheap street hustler, playing dress-up in a bespoke suit. She shouted that a custom Italian wardrobe and a platinum card could never hide the fact that he was nothing but a common low-level thief who had faked his way into her social circle. She screamed racially charged insults, mocking the neighborhood he grew up in, declaring that he had dragged her down into the gutter with him. She paced back and forth in front of the guards, waving her arms hysterically. She vowed she would file for a divorce before the sun went down. She swore she would take whatever assets the government did not seize. She screamed that she would never have let him touch her, never would have legally bound her name to his if she had known his entire net worth was built on a pathetic federal crime. Jamal's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. His ego, already fractured by Trevor's betrayal, could not withstand the absolute humiliation of his trophy wife, dismantling his manhood in front of armed federal agents and his ex-wife. He stopped fighting the guards and leaned forward over the desk, his eyes wide and manic. He retaliated with a brutal, calculated strike. He laughed a deep, cruel sound that echoed through the lobby. He told Brittany she was nothing but a hired accessory, a cheap, depreciating asset he had purchased to decorate his corporate events. He screamed that she brought absolutely zero value to his life beyond looking good in a luxury car. Brittany shrieked, striking the fiberglass barrier with her open palm. She shouted that she had sacrificed her prime years playing house with him. She screamed that she had endured the absolute misery of pretending to care about his pathetic, whining teenage daughter just to maintain his precious public image. She called Chloe a spoiled, insufferable brat who dragged down every holiday and ruined every vacation, screaming that managing the teenager's dramatic moods was a full-time job she was no longer willing to do for free. The mention of his daughter pushed Jamal completely over the edge. In his desperate blind rage to hurt Brittany and justify his own sociopathic behavior, he abandoned every shred of his paternal facade. He roared across the lobby, his voice shaking the glass windows. He told Brittany to stop pretending she was a martyr. He confessed loudly and clearly exactly why they were all in Aspen in the first place. He screamed that he did not care about the holiday. He did not care about the snowboards or the luxury cabin. He revealed that the Defense Contract Audit Agency had been breathing down his neck for months, demanding character references and personal background checks to verify his security clearance. Jamal admitted he needed the wholesome, perfect family optics to keep the federal auditors off his back. He screamed that he only brought Chloe to Aspen to use her as a human shield. He needed the photographs of them opening gifts by the fire. He needed the social media posts of them skiing. He explicitly stated that his daughter was nothing more than a necessary temporary PR prop, designed to make him look like a devoted, trustworthy family man to his military investors. He shouted that the moment the audit was clear, he was going to send Chloe to a boarding school in Switzerland just to get her out of his sight. Maya stood near the interior security door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had anticipated Jamal's greed. She had prepared for his arrogance. She had not prepared for the sheer suffocating evil of listening to a father gleefully describe weaponizing his own child's love to facilitate treason. She stepped forward, ready to order the guards to drag Jamal into a holding cell and end the sickening display. But as she moved, a flicker of motion in the far corner of the lobby caught her eye. The visitor center featured a small recessed waiting area near the vending machines, partially obscured by a column. Maya's gaze snapped to the shadows. Chloe was standing there. She had been brought inside the public lobby by a base liaison officer to warm up while Maya handled the initial perimeter breach. The 15-year-old girl stood completely frozen, her oversized winter coat sliding off her shoulder. Her phone lay shattered on the linoleum floor at her feet. Chloe had heard every single word. She had heard the woman she tried to please call her a spoiled, insufferable burden. She had heard her father, the man whose approval she craved more than anything in the world, enthusiastically confess that her entire existence was merely a corporate prop. The profound, agonizing devastation on the teenager's face was total. Her world, her identity, and her father's love had just been revealed as a grotesque, calculated lie. Chloe let out a single strangled gasp. She did not look at her father. She did not look at Maya. She turned blindly toward the exit. She hit the automatic glass doors at a full sprint, bursting out of the visitor center and disappearing into the freezing, chaotic Washington traffic before anyone could move to stop her. The heavy glass doors of the visitor center had barely closed behind Chloe before my military instincts entirely overrode my maternal shock. I did not waste a single breath on Jamal or Brittany, whose vicious screaming match was still echoing off the concrete walls of the lobby. I turned to the lead military police officer and ordered him to detain all three individuals in separate high-security holding cells until the federal prosecutors arrived. I ignored Jamal screaming my name as the guards tackled him to the floor, his designer suit sliding against the polished linoleum. I sprinted out of the lobby, crossing the frozen courtyard straight toward the base's tactical surveillance hub. My daughter was out there in the freezing Washington traffic with no phone, no money, and a completely shattered reality. I slammed my ID onto the operations desk and ordered the duty officer to pull up the metropolitan traffic grid immediately. We synced the military base feeds with the city's closed-circuit cameras, utilizing the facial recognition software, usually reserved for tracking high-value targets. I stood over the glowing monitors, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, scanning grids of blurry gray footage. It took 7 agonizing minutes. A camera caught a glimpse of her oversized winter coat, hurrying past a subway entrance, then sprinting recklessly across a busy intersection. I traced her frantic path block by block as she moved further away from the affluent government district and deeper into the older, neglected neighborhoods of the city. She finally stopped outside a faded neon sign flickering weakly against the gray afternoon sky. The camera caught her pushing open the heavy glass door of a run-down Greasy Spoon diner. I stared at the monitor, the breath completely leaving my lungs. It was Pete's Diner. It was the exact place Jamal and I used to sit for hours sharing a single plate of fries when we were broke, exhausted college students, back when his ambition was fueled by passion instead of pure venomous greed. I threw my headset onto the console and grabbed my keys. 10 minutes later, I pulled my unmarked federal vehicle up to the curb, the flashing neon light buzzing loudly above the cracked sidewalk. I pushed through the battered door. The diner smelled exactly the same, a heavy familiar mix of old coffee, fried oil, and industrial cleaner. It was a million miles away from the private jets, the designer ski lodges, and the platinum credit cards Chloe had become accustomed to. I spotted her immediately in the very back booth. She looked impossibly small, curled up against the peeling vinyl upholstery, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Her face was buried in her arms, her shoulders shaking with silent, heavy sobs. A sympathetic waitress had placed a mug of hot chocolate in front of her, entirely untouched. I walked over quietly, my combat boots making no sound on the checkered linoleum. I slid into the booth across from her. I did not say a word. I did not offer a lecture. I simply reached across the scratched laminate table and rested my hand firmly over hers. Chloe flinched at the sudden touch, then slowly raised her head. Her face was red and swollen, her eyes completely devoid of the defiant, entitled spark she had carried around for the last 2 years. She looked at me, her lower lip trembling violently. She braced herself, clearly expecting me to unleash a torrent of righteous anger, to demand apologies, or to coldly remind her that I had warned her about Jamal's true nature. I did none of those things. I simply squeezed her cold hand and told her she was safe. That single sentence broke the dam completely. Chloe let out a shattered, agonizing cry. She reached across the table, grabbing my forearms with a desperate, bruising grip. The apology poured out of her in a chaotic, breathless rush. She cried that she was so stupid. She confessed that she knew the constant gifts, the heavy black cards, and the luxury vacations felt hollow. But she wanted so badly to believe her father loved her enough to give her the world. She wept as she admitted she had chosen the shiny, fake reality over my strict rules, because it was easier to be bought than to be disciplined. She told me she had heard every single word Brittany said about her being a burden. She had heard Jamal admit she was nothing more than a human shield for his federal audit. The realization that her entire lifestyle was a calculated bribe designed to hurt me had completely destroyed her. I stood up, moved to her side of the booth, and pulled her into my arms. I wrapped my heavy uniform jacket around her shivering shoulders, holding her tightly as she sobbed into my chest. I told her softly that the adults in her life had failed her, that Jamal's greed was his own disease, and that she was never ever a prop to me. I stroked her hair, letting the absolute wreckage of her father's manipulation wash away in the quiet, grimy diner where our family had actually started. For a long time we just sat there. The chaotic Washington traffic rushed by outside the foggy windows, entirely separate from the quiet sanctuary of the booth. Slowly, Chloe's breathing began to even out. The frantic, terrified trembling stopped. She pulled back slightly, wiping her tear-stained cheeks with the sleeves of her coat. She looked up at me, a sudden, sharp clarity hardening her swollen eyes. The devastated teenager was suddenly gone, replaced by a girl who had just learned a brutal lesson in survival. She sniffled, sitting up straighter against the vinyl seat. Then she unzipped the deep front pocket of her oversized winter coat. She reached inside and pulled out a small metallic object, placing it directly in the center of the scratched table with a heavy thud. It was a military-grade, encrypted flash drive. I stared at the device, my pulse spiking instantly. Chloe looked me directly in the eye, her voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. She told me she had gone back into the Aspen cabin right before the federal agents breached the front door. She said she knew her father always hid his most important files in the secret lining of his leather travel bag. She took it before she ran into the snow. She pushed the heavy metal drive across the table, stopping inches from my hand. She told me she thought I needed it. I closed my fingers tightly over the cold metal of the encrypted flash drive. The physical weight of Jamal's impending destruction rested perfectly in my palm. That small device, handed to me by the daughter he had so callously discarded, held the final pieces of his fraudulent empire. I did not waste another second in that diner. I immediately drove Chloe to a secure, undisclosed safe house with my trusted security detail, ensuring she was completely insulated from the incoming fallout. I arranged for a specialized trauma counselor to stay with her, promising my daughter that her nightmare was finally over. Then I went to war. For 14 agonizing days, my cyber intelligence team and I ripped apart the contents of the drive. We worked around the clock in a heavily classified basement terminal, cross-referencing every hidden offshore account, every forged signature, and every phantom invoice with Trevor's desperate, sniveling confession. Jamal had hidden his stolen millions well, but the decryption key Chloe provided sliced through his digital security like a scalpel. The web of federal fraud was undeniably vast, implicating several other high-ranking corporate officers at Apex Solutions, but the paper trail inevitably and undeniably led directly back to Jamal. The evidence was absolute. 14 days later, the trap snapped shut. The Department of Defense Tribunal convened in a highly classified subterranean boardroom located deep within the Pentagon's secure annex. The room was designed specifically to strip away power and intimidate high-level federal suspects. Massive acoustic oak walls absorbed all sound, eliminating any echo and making the space feel suffocatingly tight. A long, polished mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, flanked by heavy, rigid leather chairs. The presidential seal and the emblem of the Department of Defense loomed ominously on the far wall, cast in heavy bronze. It was a room where corporate careers were permanently ended and lengthy federal sentences were finalized. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy steel security doors at the back of the room slid open with a mechanical hiss. Jamal strode inside. Even facing a full federal tribunal, his arrogance was absolutely staggering. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal Italian suit, walking with the exaggerated, overly confident swagger of a man who firmly believed the rules simply did not apply to him. He was flanked by a team of 4 high-priced corporate defense attorneys. These were slick, aggressive men who charged by the minute and specialized in burying government auditors under mountains of confusing legal paperwork and procedural delays. Jamal took his seat at the defendant's side of the table. He casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaning back in his chair with a sickeningly familiar, condescending smirk. He leaned over and whispered something into the ear of his lead counsel, a silver-haired man clutching a thick leather briefcase. Jamal laughed aloud, a short, dismissive sound that felt entirely out of place in the severe military environment. He firmly believed this hearing was a mere formality. He thought his offshore accounts were still safely insulated. He assumed his expensive lawyers could easily dismiss Trevor's tearful confession as the desperate, fabricated lies of a disgruntled former employee trying to save his own skin. Jamal thought his heavy political donations and elite country club connections would turn a massive treasonous embezzlement operation into a minor administrative error, punishable by a simple, manageable corporate fine. He was absolutely certain he was walking into this room to bully a faceless, low-level government bureaucrat into submission. He checked his heavy platinum watch, drumming his manicured fingers impatiently against the polished mahogany, clearly ready to brush off the federal government like a minor inconvenience. He was completely unprepared for the reality of his situation. At exactly 5 minutes past the hour, the massive double oak doors at the head of the boardroom swung open. The armed bailiff called the room to attention, his voice booming off the paneled walls. Jamal's lawyers immediately stood, adhering strictly to standard courtroom decorum. Jamal remained seated for an extra defiant second, a deliberate display of disrespect toward the tribunal, before slowly rising to his feet, still wearing that infuriating, untouchable smirk. I walked through the doors. The collective sharp intake of breath from the defense table was audible across the room. I was not wearing the modest civilian business suits I usually wore around town. I was not wearing the inexpensive clothes Jamal and Brittany had relentlessly mocked as cheap and pathetic. I was wearing my full formal military dress uniform. The deep navy blue fabric was immaculate and perfectly tailored. The golden oak leaves on my shoulders caught the harsh recessed lighting, signifying my senior command rank. Pinned precisely above my left breast pocket were rows of heavily earned commendations medals for exemplary cyber warfare service, joint task force leadership, and classified overseas deployments. These were highly restricted decorations Jamal never knew existed because he had never once bothered to ask about my career, entirely content to write me off as a lowly, insignificant pencil pusher. I did not look at him as I entered. I maintained absolute military bearing, my posture perfectly rigid, my face a mask of cold, uncompromising authority. I marched directly to the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by 2 four-star generals and a senior federal prosecutor. I pulled out the heavy center chair and sat down, taking my position as the lead interrogator. I reached into my uniform pocket and carefully placed the black titanium flash drive directly in the center of the table. I folded my hands, rested them on the wood, and finally raised my eyes, locking my gaze onto the man who had tormented me and manipulated my daughter for over a decade. The smirk on Jamal's face did not just vanish, it violently disintegrated. He dropped back into his leather chair, as if all the bones in his legs had suddenly liquefied completely, ignoring the shocked glances of his legal team. His mouth fell open. His eyes darted frantically from the golden insignia on my shoulders to the rows of military medals on my chest, and finally to the encrypted black flash drive resting ominously on the table. The invincible illusion of his immense wealth and power shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of him. His lead counsel leaned down, whispering frantically, demanding to know who I was and why the lead interrogator for the Department of Defense looked exactly like his client's ex-wife. Jamal could not form a single word. He simply stared at me, his chest heaving, the blood completely draining from his face, as he realized the absolute terrifying magnitude of his miscalculation. The silence in the subterranean boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Jamal stared at the medals on my chest, his mind frantically trying to reconcile the broke, exhausted woman he had discarded with the high-ranking federal director sitting across from him. His lead counsel, a silver-haired man with an expensive briefcase, recovered his composure first. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding to know the meaning of this theatrical display and threatening to file an immediate grievance with the Inspector General. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I opened the thick manila folder resting in front of me and began to read. I laid out the exact architecture of Apex Solutions fraud with clinical, devastating precision. I detailed the phantom invoices submitted to the Defense Contract Audit Agency. I listed the specific shell companies Trevor had established in Delaware and Nevada. I read aloud the routing numbers for the Cayman Island accounts where the stolen taxpayer funds had been hidden. With every sentence, Jamal sank deeper into his heavy leather chair. The arrogant smirk that had defined his face for a decade was entirely gone, replaced by a pale, sweating mask of sheer terror. His legal team shifted uncomfortably. The lead counsel attempted to interject, asserting that all financial discrepancies were the sole responsibility of the chief financial officer. He tried to claim that Jamal, as the CEO, was entirely unaware of any illegal accounting practices orchestrated by Trevor. I let him finish his prepared defense. Then I tapped my index finger against the black titanium flash drive resting in the center of the mahogany table. I informed the room that Trevor was currently sitting in federal custody, having signed a comprehensive confession detailing Jamal's direct daily involvement in the embezzlement scheme. The lawyers flinched, their pens freezing over their legal pads. But Trevor's testimony was only the foundation of the government's case. I pushed the black flash drive an inch forward. I explained that this drive contained Jamal's personal, unredacted financial ledgers. It held the digital footprints, linking the stolen military funds directly to his private accounts. It documented every illegal wire transfer used to purchase the Aspen estate, the luxury vehicles, and the extravagant designer gifts. Jamal stared at the drive. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He knew exactly what that piece of hardware was. He knew he kept it hidden in the secret lining of his leather travel bag. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden horrifying realization. He demanded to know how I got it. He insisted the FBI never searched his personal luggage during the raid. I looked at him with absolute glacial contempt. I told him the FBI did not secure the drive. His daughter did. I watched the devastating truth hit him like a physical blow. I told Jamal that Chloe had heard his entire vicious rant in the visitor center lobby. I made sure he understood that she heard him call her a spoiled burden and a temporary public relations prop. I told him that before she ran out into the snow, she took the drive from his bag and handed it directly to me. His own flesh and blood, the child he had weaponized and manipulated for years, was the one who delivered the final, inescapable evidence of his treason. The air in the room felt visibly heavier. Jamal's legal team immediately began whispering frantically among themselves. The bravado had completely evaporated from their side of the table. The silver-haired lawyer leaned in urgently, whispering into Jamal's ear, his hand covering his mouth to shield his words. Even from across the room, his message was obvious. The case was unwinnable. The evidence was absolute. They were advising him to surrender immediately. Jamal ignored them. He shoved his lawyer away, his hands gripping the edge of the heavy oak table. The billionaire CEO facade shattered completely, leaving behind a desperate, pathetic man grasping at anything to save himself from a life behind bars. He leaned forward, his voice cracking, dripping with a sudden manufactured vulnerability. He called me by my first name. He begged me to remember where we started, to remember the struggles we faced when we were just two broke college students trying to build a life. He invoked the years we spent together, twisting our history to sound like a tragic misunderstanding rather than a calculated abandonment. When he saw my expression remain entirely unchanged, he played his final desperate card. He brought up Chloe. He pleaded with me to think about our daughter. He begged for leniency, insisting that sending him to federal prison would permanently destroy Chloe's life. He promised to pay back every single dollar with interest. He swore he would disappear and let us live in peace. He looked at me with tears pooling in his eyes, his voice breaking as he stated that no matter what happened, we were still family. He begged me not to do this to our family. I sat perfectly still, letting his pathetic, manipulative words echo through the soundproof room. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. "Jamal," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence with lethal absolute authority. "This table is for federal investigators and defendants. We are not family." The finality of my words struck him like a physical execution. He slumped back into his chair, staring blankly at the bronze seal of the Department of Defense on the wall behind me. His lead counsel immediately addressed the tribunal, his voice shaking slightly as he formally requested a recess to discuss an immediate plea agreement with his client. He stated that Mr. Hayes was prepared to offer full cooperation with the federal government. Jamal was entirely broken. The victory was absolute. The oppressive shadow he had cast over my life for 10 years had been eradicated by the very system he thought he was smart enough to manipulate. But I was not finished. I looked past the broken CEO and his panicking legal team, my gaze locked onto the gallery seating directly behind the defense table. Brittany was sitting there huddled in a stiff wooden chair. Her designer clothes looked entirely out of place in the stark military room. She had been clutching a tissue, watching her husband's empire disintegrate with wide, terrified eyes. I raised my hand, signaling the guards at the back of the room. The heavy steel doors slid open once again. Two stern, unsmiling agents wearing dark suits and badges identifying them as the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service marched into the boardroom. They bypassed the defense table entirely and stopped directly in front of the gallery. Brittany froze her breath, hitching audibly in her throat. She looked from the federal agents to her husband, then finally to me, pure panic radiating from her trembling frame. I rested my hands flat on the mahogany table, addressing her with cold, unwavering precision. "You thought you could enjoy the spoils of treason without facing the consequences," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "But the federal government tracks every signature, since you legally co-signed the fraudulent joint tax returns, and since your name is explicitly listed on the deed to the Aspen cabin, you are equally culpable." I gave her a single definitive nod as the IRS agents pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You are going down with him." The cold, mechanical click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the acoustic oak panels of the boardroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Brittany let out a shrill, hyperventilating gasp as the IRS agents efficiently secured her wrists, yanking her arms behind her back. She violently twisted her shoulders, her designer silk blouse tearing slightly at the seam as she tried to pull away from the towering federal agents. She screamed Jamal's name, her voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic, begging him to fix it, to tell them she had nothing to do with his business, to throw his lawyers at the problem. Jamal did not even look at her. He sat completely paralyzed in his heavy leather chair, his jaw slack, his eyes fixed blankly on the polished mahogany table. The silver-haired defense attorney immediately stepped away from Brittany, raising his hands in a universal gesture of legal surrender. He knew better than to interfere with an active federal criminal investigation, especially one backed by irrefutable documentary evidence. The IRS agents dragged Brittany out of the boardroom, her frantic, sobbing cries fading as the heavy steel doors sealed shut behind her. The tribunal formally accepted Jamal's unconditional surrender exactly 30 seconds later. There was no prolonged trial. There was no grand theatrical courtroom battle. There was only the swift, ruthless efficiency of the federal government dismantling a traitor. The eradication of Jamal's empire happened with breathtaking speed. By the time the sun set that evening, Federal agents had raided the corporate headquarters of Apex Solutions. They marched through the towering glass atrium in tactical gear, seizing every server filing cabinet and hard drive in the building. The corporate accounts were frozen, instantly halting all operations. The Department of Justice initiated aggressive asset forfeiture proceedings, legally stripping Jamal of everything he claimed defined his worth. The sprawling Aspen cabin, the site of his supposed triumph and his weapon against my daughter, was seized and immediately listed for federal auction. The luxury imported vehicles were towed from his manicured driveway in the dead of night. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the ones he believed were completely untraceable, were drained by federal cyber units and the funds repatriated directly to the United States Treasury. 2 weeks later, Jamal stood in a sterile, heavily guarded federal courtroom in Alexandria. He was no longer wearing his custom Italian suits. He wore the standard ill-fitting orange jumpsuit of a federal inmate, his hands and ankles bound by heavy steel transport chains that clanked loudly against the linoleum floor. The judge looked down at him from the bench with undisguised disgust. For orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar fraud against the Department of Defense and utilizing offshore shell companies to hide stolen taxpayer funds, Jamal was sentenced to 22 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. I watched from the back of the gallery as the armed bailiffs led him away. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine one final time. There was no arrogance left. There was only the hollow, terrified realization that he was nothing. Trevor fared only slightly better, though his punishment was equally permanent. Because he had provided the initial confession and the cryptographic keys necessary to unlock the offshore routing numbers, the federal prosecutors honored their plea agreement. He avoided a lengthy prison sentence, serving 18 months in a minimum security facility for his cooperation. However, the judge showed absolutely no mercy regarding his professional future. Trevor was permanently stripped of his CPA license and hit with a lifetime ban from working in the financial sector or holding any fiduciary responsibility for the rest of his life. The man who had sold his soul to architect a massive embezzlement scheme was reduced to absolute professional ruin. He would spend the rest of his life working minimum-wage hourly jobs, forever branded as a federal informant and a corporate fraud. His entire identity as a brilliant financial strategist was erased with the strike of a gavel. Brittany's descent was a public, agonizing spectacle. The federal government seized all her joint assets, leaving her absolutely destitute overnight. The shiny fake reality she had chosen over basic human decency evaporated into thin air. The society pages and local gossip blogs that used to feature her lavish lifestyle now splashed her tear-stained, makeup-free face across their front pages. Paparazzi hounded her outside the federal courthouse, documenting her grueling legal battles as she fought desperately to avoid serving prison time alongside Jamal for tax evasion and conspiracy. Without Jamal's stolen money to pay her legal fees, she was forced to sell off her collection of designer bags, jewelry, and shoes at pawn shops just to afford a heavily discounted entry-level defense attorney. With no money, no home, and her reputation utterly destroyed, Brittany had nowhere else to go. She was forced to move back into her parents' damp, unfinished basement in the suburbs. The woman who had proudly called my daughter a burden, who had flaunted her stolen wealth to inflict pain, was now sleeping on a cheap air mattress, surrounded by cardboard boxes on a cold concrete floor. She became a total social pariah, completely shunned by the wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress. Every time she walked into a grocery store or a courtroom, she was recognized as the disgraced wife of a convicted federal embezzler. While their lives turned to ash, I returned to the Pentagon. Chloe was safe enrolled in a private therapy program and finally free from the toxic manipulation that had clouded her teenage years. With my family secure, I walked down the expansive, heavily guarded corridors of the E-Ring, the soles of my boots clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floors. I did not walk with the frantic, desperate energy I had carried weeks ago when I was tearing apart the city looking for my daughter. I walked with the absolute uncompromising authority of a commander who had successfully executed a flawless tactical operation. I reached the heavy oak doors of the Central Command Suite and presented my credentials to the armed guards. They saluted sharply and pulled the heavy doors open. General Sterling was waiting for me behind his massive desk, flanked by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. The general stood up, extending his hand. He did not ask about my ex-husband or the personal nature of the operation. He only spoke of the unprecedented success of the cyber raid, the flawless recovery of classified federal assets, and my exceptional leadership under extreme pressure. He handed me a sealed blue folder bearing the presidential seal. Effective immediately, I was being promoted to a highly prestigious upper echelon directorship within the Pentagon's Strategic Command. I was given absolute authority over a newly formed elite cyber task force, answering only to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I took the folder, feeling the heavy embossed seal against my fingertips. I had not just survived Jamal's attempt to destroy me. I had clinically dismantled him, secured my daughter's future, and reclaimed my absolute power. 6 months later, the air inside my home smelled of roasted rosemary, melted butter, and wood smoke. There were no caterers rushing through the hallways carrying trays of overpriced caviar. There were no forced, stiff conversations with shallow corporate executives trying to impress one another. There was absolutely no performative luxury designed to mask a hollow, rotting core. It was just Thanksgiving, and for the first time in over a decade, the holiday felt entirely pure. I stood at the kitchen island, pulling a heavy ceramic roasting pan out of the oven. Outside the frosted windows, the late November wind whipped through the bare branches of the oak trees lining our quiet suburban street. Inside, it was completely warm and undeniably safe. The constant suffocating tension that used to define my life, the sensation of walking on eggshells, waiting for Jamal's next manipulation or Brittany's next passive-aggressive insult, had been thoroughly eradicated. They were ghosts now, banished to federal prison cells and damp basement air mattresses, completely stripped of their power to harm us. I set the pan down and looked across the kitchen. Chloe was standing by the sink washing a bundle of fresh sage. She wore a simple faded knit sweater and comfortable jeans. Her hair was pulled up into a messy knot, and she was quietly humming along to the jazz music playing softly from the countertop radio. The transformation in my daughter over the past 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. The defensive, entitled teenager who used to demand platinum credit cards and scoff at anything lacking a designer label had completely vanished. In her place stood a grounded, resilient young woman who had survived the absolute destruction of her reality and emerged stronger than I could have ever hoped. Through intensive trauma counseling and a brutal re-education in the real world, Chloe had shed the toxic programming her father had forced upon her. She had willingly surrendered the heavy black cards and the keys to the luxury cars the federal government had not already seized. Instead of spending her weekends flying to private ski lodges, she had spent the entire autumn working part-time at a local neighborhood bookstore. She restocked shelves, managed the cash register, and dealt with difficult customers for minimum wage. She was learning the actual value of $1, earning her own money, and discovering a sense of pride that Jamal's empty bribes had never been able to provide. She turned off the faucet and brought the sage over to the cutting board, flashing me a genuine, unburdened smile. There was no defiance in her eyes anymore. There was only mutual respect and a deep, unspoken understanding between us. We had survived the war, and we had done it together. I carried the final dishes into the dining room. The table was small, set only for 2. It was a million miles away from the massive, intimidating formal dining room in Aspen, where Jamal used to hold court. We sat down across from each other, the soft glow of a single candle illuminating the space between us. I looked at the food we had prepared with our own hands, and a profound wave of gratitude washed over me. I had reclaimed my absolute power at the Pentagon, commanding an elite cyber task force and reporting directly to the highest echelons of the military. But sitting right here sharing a simple, quiet meal with my daughter was my ultimate victory. We filled our plates and ate in comfortable, easy companionship. We talked about her classes at the local high school, which she was navigating with a newly discovered academic focus. We talked about the quirky regular customers she served at the bookstore. She laughed a bright, clear sound that completely filled the room, recounting a story about dropping a stack of hardcover novels right in front of her manager. I listened to her voice, marveling at how light it sounded. The heavy, crushing anxiety of living under Jamal's shadow had been entirely washed away. As we finished the last of the meal, the conversation naturally lulled into a peaceful silence. Chloe set her fork down and wiped her mouth with a cloth napkin. She looked down at her lap, suddenly appearing a bit nervous, shifting her weight in the wooden dining chair. She took a deep breath, sitting up straighter, and reached into the deep front pocket of her jeans. She pulled out a small, slightly dented cardboard box. It was plain white, lacking any velvet lining, satin ribbons, or embossed designer logos. She pushed it across the table toward me, her eyes tracking my reaction closely. I looked at the simple cardboard box, my pulse slowing into a steady, calm rhythm. I did not ask what it was. I simply reached out and lifted the lid. Resting on a small square of white cotton was a delicate braided silver bracelet. It was completely unpretentious. There were no heavy diamonds, no flashy emeralds, and no absurd price tags attached. It was a modest, quiet piece of jewelry woven together with careful precision. I stared at the silver strands, the breath catching slightly in my throat. Chloe leaned forward, her voice dropping into a soft, intensely earnest register. She told me she had bought it with the very first paycheck she earned from the bookstore. She explained that she had saved her hourly wages and her small tips in a glass jar on her dresser for exactly 2 months until she had enough to purchase it from a local artisan craft market downtown. She wanted to buy me something entirely with her own money. She wanted to give me something that was actually real. I carefully lifted the silver bracelet from the cotton. The metal was cool and light against my fingertips. I had worn military medals of valor. I had worn heavy, expensive jewelry forced upon me during the early days of my marriage to Jamal. But holding this simple $40 braided band, I knew I was holding the single most valuable object I had ever owned. It was forged from my daughter's independence, her hard work, and her restored integrity. It was the absolute antithesis of everything her father represented. I looked across the table. Chloe's eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her expression was remarkably solid and secure. She did not look away. She met my gaze with the absolute clarity of a survivor who had finally found safe harbor. She reached across the table, gently taking the bracelet from my hands. I held out my wrist, and she carefully wrapped the silver band around it, securing the small metal clasp. Her fingers were warm against my skin. She smoothed the braided silver flat against my wrist, letting her hand linger there for a long moment. She looked up at me, the candlelight catching the absolute sincerity in her eyes. The terrified, lost teenager from the frozen Colorado highway was gone forever. She smiled, a quiet, unshakable expression of pure peace. "I am glad I am here with my real family," she said. I looked at the silver bracelet shining softly against my skin. I looked at the daughter I had fought so fiercely to save, sitting safe and whole in our quiet home. The hollow, toxic empire of lies had been burned to the ground, and in its ashes, we had built something beautiful. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, squeezing it firmly. The warmth of the room wrapped around us, sealing out the cold winter night. The closure was absolute sweet and perfectly earned. The greatest lesson from this ordeal is that true power is never built on lies, manipulation, or performative wealth. When people prove their love is conditional, the bravest thing you can do is walk away. You do not have to fight for a seat at a table where you are not respected. Authentic healing begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those who broke you and instead build a life rooted in your own integrity. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic relationship to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.